1 week season.
Hello, friends and Inner Circle fam. Welcome to the Week 13 edition of the OWS Roster Review podcast. I'm your host, StatATL. I've got more than a dozen subscriber rosters to review today, so let's hop in. First roster comes from OWS member G. Heller. It is a $5 single entry with 19,000 entrants. G. Heller started this roster with a Purdy skinny stack with Brandon Ayuk, brought it back with A.J. Brown. I really like this build. Next part of the roster features both Devin Singletary and Brevin Jordan, as those were kind of two of the best on-paper ways to attack Denver. I thought this combination, this correlation is really sharp and unique. I felt a lot of people are not going to build with two Texans like this. And so I really like this, something that I did on a handful of rosters as well. The roster then features Mostert and the Dolphins D. So this is really strong leverage off the Tyreek Hill chalk. As we'll talk through in a lot of the rosters today, I really felt like you needed to account for the Miami Dolphins on every roster. On this roster, the only one-offs are Greg Dortch and Zach Moss. OWS as a whole was really high on Greg Dortch, myself included, so I feel like this was a really strong one-off piece. On this roster, I think the only thing I would have considered doing differently was considering either Johan Dotson or Curtis Samuel instead of Moss for the correlation with Mostert and Dolphins D. Not like a necessary change, just one that I liked because I was way underweight on Moss this week. But overall, a really good build, and thank you for the submission. The next roster comes from Totally Not the FBI. This is a repeat user. Just honestly, I think he gets the upper hand. I get lots of repeat users every week, but this guy has the best name. So sorry, featured again. So this is a $20 Milymaker roster. So it's 150 max contest, like 175,000 entrants. This is a Sam Howell and Curtis Samuel skinny stack with Devon Achane and Tyreek as bringbacks. So as part of that game stack, I thought this was a really sharp build. Personally, I played almost exclusively 3 quarterbacks across 300 plus lineups, and Howell was my highest owned. So I started several builds exactly like this. I primarily had Mostert instead of Devon Achane, but obviously, this was a great build as well. Roster then has a nice mini correlation with Devonta Smith and Deebo Samuel. So I really liked getting exposure to both of the two best game environments on the slate between Washington, Miami, as well as the Eagles and 49ers. The roster then has Zach Moss and Brevin Jordan as one-offs. These were two of the highest projected point per dollar plays on the slate, both totally fine as one-offs, and their ownership reflected that. So I think my only feedback on this build is in such a large contest like the Milymaker. I think it's around potential uniqueness. So this roster, you have 5 pieces that are over 20% owned, including Moss and Tyreek Hill, which were both uber chalk. So even though Howell's only 14% owned, he was the second highest quarterback owned as well on the slate. So I think my suggestion would be to pivot off Moss to maybe Antonio Gibson, just based on the construction on this to make it part of a full game stack. Or you could potentially go to Zeke Elliott instead of Moss to correlate with the Patriots D, and that's a way to have a little differentiation in a 175,000 entrant contest. But overall, a really strong roster. Thank you for the submission this week. Totally not the FBI. Our next roster comes from Black Eyed God. It's a $27 single entry with 3,200 entrants. Roster features a Joe Flacco double stack with Amari Cooper and David Njoku. So no bringback on this roster. So I saw several other sharp people I know who were playing Flacco doubles this past week. We're actually going to get to one of those rosters later in the review. It's not a spot that I got to personally, but at 4,600, he did open up a lot. And the three combined between Flacco, Amari Cooper, and Njoku only cost 14.4K. So I think it's very reasonable for that group to combine for 55 points and keep you on that 200-point pace. So not a spot that I got to, but upon review, I do think it was more viable than giving credit for. So then the roster features Ramondre Stevenson and the Patriots D correlation. Really tough break with Ramondre getting injured so early in the game. He was one of my core running backs at 30+% ownership. So I feel your pain here as well. The roster then features Zach Moss, Tyreek Hill, Nico Collins, and Deebo Samuels as one-offs. So I think in a vacuum, these are all good plays. We haven't talked about Nico Collins yet. However, I personally had a rule of 80% of my lineups containing a Texan. So I think as we discussed on the Slate pod with Zandamir and Hilo this week, the Texans are second in the league in terms of 30-point scorers, in terms of DK points. So I loved playing him or Tank Dell or Singletary specifically, or Brevin Jordan as one-off. So I focus on getting one Texan on my rosters this week. So I guess as we've discussed on previous episodes of the stream, it doesn't mean that a roster built this way can't win. You got really good results from Nico Collins, from Deebo Samuel. It's just more things that you have to get right. So, as such, I'm going to keep preaching more correlation. So I think if you're playing Tyreek, maybe you go Antonio Gibson instead of Moss. Or even though obviously it didn't score as well this week, maybe you go DeAndre Hopkins instead of Deebo or Nico Collins. Just kind of food for thought on that. Good roster overall, though. Thank you for the submission, Black Eyed God. So our next roster comes from Inner Circle member Solo Hustle. This is a mini max, 150 max roster in the 50 cent. It's 350,000 entrants, so a huge contest. This is a Purdy double stack with Deebo and Brandon Ayuk. Brought it back with Devonta Smith. So while Purdy, Deebo, and Ayuk are all reasonably popular, they likely weren't played together all that often just because of the salary. And then I like that you excluded both Moss and Tyreek from this build. So in a contest this large, while I thought both were strong on paper plays, I do like the differentiation in a contest this size. So, knowing that you likely couldn't feasibly get to Tyreek due to salary, I like how you accounted for Miami by rostering Devon Chan and the Vikings, and the Dolphins D, as it was so likely that Miami as an offense just altogether failed. So I like that you accounted for that as well. And again, different. Final piece of, the roster then features a mini correlation with Rashad White and Jonathan Mingo. So I really like that. I've written up Mingo the past 2 weeks. I felt like he offered decent upside for his price. And so, he's on the field 90% of the time. He's seeing 6 targets a game. And he put up 13 points at 3.3K, and he still doesn't have a touchdown on the season yet. So he's a play that I really like and have been playing a lot personally. And then the final piece of the roster is Brevin Jordan, a salary saver, strong point per dollar piece. Solo Hustle, thank you for the submission this week. This was one of my favorite rosters on the week of the 30 plus submissions that I got, not just because it scored well, but because of the pieces and the way that you accounted for so many different plays. Thank you for the submission. The next roster we'll review comes from OWS member Off the Scene. This is a $1 3 max contest with 18,000 entrants. It is a Tua double stack with Tyreek and Waddle, and you brought it back with Curtis Samuel. So personally, I really liked this construction. This was definitely a spot for a Tua double against the horrible Commanders D and secondary. So I really like this. Tua was one of 3 quarterbacks in my pool this week. So I had plenty of Tyreek and Waddle doubles as well myself. So roster then also features both Singletary and Brevin Jordan. Again, 2 of the best on paper plays, ways to attack Denver. I really thought this was a sharp correlation. So Najee Harris as a one-off is fine. I think I'd rather see you get up to the Steelers D with Najee or include like Greg Dortch for the correlation. This roster features Njoku and the Browns D. So personally, I don't love double tight end builds, especially when both are cheaper tight ends, and in a contest with 18,000 entrants, I think it really just kind of caps your upside. So I think if you're playing the Browns D, maybe consider Ford instead of Harris. And then, if you're going to punt at the flex spot, you could always go for a ceiling play like Marvin Mims to correlate with Singletary or Brevin Jordan, or Tutu Atwell to correlate with the Browns D. With the thinking that if the Browns D get a defensive touchdown, the Rams are passing more. So again, thank you for the submission this week Off the Scene. Aloha Maui Gawi. Thank you for the roster submission this week. It is a $12 single entry with 2,400 entrants. This roster is a Howell overstack with Johan Dotson, Curtis Samuel, and Logan Thomas. Brought it back with Tyreek Hill. So I think when you first sent this to me, you made a comment about you thinking it was too cute. However, I think I kind of disagree. I think in a smallish tournament like this with only 2,000 entrants, I think this is totally viable. Howell actually set a season low for pass attempts yesterday, despite playing the entire game. And Brian Robinson, who's their primary first and second down back, getting injured, and the Commanders falling way behind. So in my opinion, this was a complete outlier run out. We got what we wanted with Tyreek having a great game, for this build, Tyreek having a great game, thinking that all of those things would lead to Howell passing more. However, it was just not the run out we got. So I think at only 12.3K for all 3 pass catchers, I think expecting kind of 35 to 40 combined points is completely feasible. That keeps you at a 3x pace. And then I think 50 to 55 is well within the realm of real possibilities, which is only 16 to 18 points each. And that's at 4 or 5x pace. So to me, I really think this was an interesting way of approaching and attacking this game, and gave you some salary flexibility with your other spots. The roster then features both Henry and Moss. So I generally don't like to play opposing running backs together. But at Moss's salary, you certainly got an outlier performance. I think that was 7.7 was his low score of the season in the games without JT or JT being eased back in. So I don't mind this. I think it caps your upside a bit, especially since you've got this full-on game stack with 3 Washington pass catchers. But I don't mind it. The final piece of the roster here is David Montgomery. So personally, I don't love this play in this contest size. I think you've already got the low-owned Henry and a 1% owned Chargers D. I think at 6,500 and splitting the backfield, I think I'd rather see you take on a little bit more certainty with Rachaad White. Or I'd account for the San Francisco-Philadelphia game with either Deebo Samuel or George Kittle. And then last piece, again, was the Chargers D, paying up to be Contrarian, facing Bailey Zappi. Again, New England has been horrendous, so I like that play as well. So thank you for the submission this week. Next roster comes from Inner Circle member DePeach. This is a $5 single entry in the 9,500 entrant contest. This is a Purdy naked build with Devontae Smith as a bringback. You've got Warren, Zach Moss, and Rachaad White as one-offs. So I think at the same price, I'd much rather see Deebo or Kittle here instead of White, especially since your bet involves a bringback. So, if Purdy is getting there and is putting up one of the top scores of the week, either raw score or point per dollar score, he's very likely bringing along one of either CMC, Ayuk, Deebo, or Kittle. And with how popular Purdy was this week, it was the highest owned quarterback on the slate. A good portion of the field is going to get his stacking partner right. So I think that you might as well take a chance on it being you instead of playing from behind with those rosters that do get it right with Deebo Samuel, for example, this week. The roster then features Tyreek Hill and Curtis Samuel as a mini correlation. I like that. Had plenty of that myself this week. Brevin Jordan and the Rams D, both solid pieces as well. So I think if you want, you could have played like Brandon Ayuk instead of Smith and had no bringback at all on the roster. I think that's totally fine. But I think if you're playing a quarterback that's not Lamar Jackson, for example, with a bringback, I think you always want to include his own pass catcher as well. So I think that would have been my real own feedback for this week, is I would have included a pass catcher for the 49ers. But thank you for the submission this week to Beach. The next roster comes from OWS user Scotty V. It is a $27 single entry in the 3,200 entrant contest. This is a Hurt skinny stack with Devonta Smith. You brought it back with Deebo Samuel. So as we've seen, Purdy was the much more popular way to build around this game. But I liked that you made this build to bet on the game a little bit differently. So I like that for some uniqueness. The roster then features Devin Singletary and Brevin Jordan, as those were on paper some of the best ways to attack Denver. Again, really sharp and unique. I like this construction. Was obviously one we talked about on OWS throughout the week. However, after that, the lineup has no other correlation. So as I've always said, it doesn't mean that a roster like this can't hit. Again, it did cash in this contest. I just think it's so many more things that you have to get right that have to break your way. So since the roster doesn't have Tyreek, I like that you accounted for the Dolphins by playing Devon Achane. I really thought that was sharp. You've then got Chris Olave. with the depleted wide receiver corp for the Saints, I also thought was a sharp way to build. You've got Greg Dortch. We've spoken about this. I thought he was really sharp. He was very popular, certainly in the OWS community. I think on this particular build, I would rather see you play Jameson Williams or Josh Reynolds instead of Greg Dortch to correlate with Olave, if that's the way you wanted to go with that. And then your final piece is Deebo Samuel. Again, another strong one-off play. I like that you played Devon Achane and Deebo to account for the two best on paper game environments. So a good roster. I'd like to see just a little bit more correlation, but appreciate the submission this week. Thank you, Scotty V. Next roster comes from Coming for the Dough. It's a $50 single entry with 4,500 entrants. Features a game stack of Miami and Washington. It's a Howell double stack with Dotson and Samuel. And you brought it back with both Mostert and Tyreek Hill. Really liked this construction. I had this exact start or something very similar with two Washington pieces on numerous builds. I really thought it was a really sharp approach this week. As we discussed kind of earlier with one of the other rosters, we just got such a poor run out from Howell, despite almost the exact situation and outcome we wanted from Miami, with them pulling ahead and Howell playing from behind. He just threw for a season low, I think, 23 pass attempts. However, I think if we played out this slate 100, 1,000 times, this construction would have many instances of 100 plus total points from this 5-player block of Howell, Mostert, Tyreek, Dotson, and Curtis Samuel. So again, it's process, it's build over the results. And I think this was a really sharp way of playing this week. Roster then features Jalen Warren and Dortch in a mini correlation. I like this. I did it quite a bit myself. Again, it just didn't work out for us this week. Doesn't mean that it wasn't a sharp way of building. So Taysom Hill as the only one-off on this roster. I don't mind it. I think with Olave kind of back in the fold, this play was a little less attractive to me at his price. But that's mostly just because I'm not personally a Taysom Hill guy. But I think overall, this is a great build. A lot of correlation. And I think despite only scoring 114 points this week, I really think it was a well-built roster. So thank you for the submission Coming for the Dough. The next roster comes from Gunslinger. $5 single entry with 9,500 entrants. So this is another Flacco double stack with Amari Cooper and Elijah Moore. No bringback. So, we did speak about this construction earlier, not one that I was on personally, but I do like the things that it potentially opened up for you with the salary savings. The roster didn't include Tyreek Hill, but did a good job of accounting for the Dolphins with Devon Achane and the Dolphins D correlation. I like that. The roster also features a mini correlation with A.J. Brown and Deebo Samuel. So I liked this a lot. You accounted for both of the best on paper game environments, and you did so differently. So a really unique build this week. And so in messaging Gunslinger, he had mentioned that he was running the same roster in 4 contests this week. So I think that if you're keeping a tight player pool and your early guys do well, and you've got some low-owned guys like Sam Laporta, like Devon Achane. I think for me, I would have liked to consider moving this roster to one with a little bit more upside. So I think that if this was your only build with so much PMR remaining for the late games, and if you really love Joe Flacco and it was your only Joe Flacco roster, obviously stay with what you loved. But if you have 2 or 3 teams where you made similar bets like this, I would have considered moving to a San Francisco, Philadelphia concentration. So Gunslinger and I actually chat weekly, and he shared this roster with me on Sunday. And as he can attest, I reached out to him about 30 minutes prior to late lock to suggest a modification. And the only reason for that was that I knew that Gunslinger ran this exact lineup in 4 different contests. So, the timing didn't work out for us with this thing, with this particular build. But I think that if you've got a roster that hits on a majority of low-owned pieces in the low game, I would suggest with one of your builds, if you've got the clones or you've got the same roster in multiple contests, for me personally, I would suggest, one build being a little less contrarian. So, an easy 2-for-2 swap would have been Flacco and AJ Brown, to move that to Purdy and Devontae Smith to go along with Debo. You could also keep one of Amari Cooper or Elijah Moore, or you could pivot to both, off both and go to Rachaad White and Mingo for another correlation, a little bit more popular pieces with a little bit higher floor, in my opinion. Again, it's tough to do in the moment, just kind of food for thought, especially if you're kind of running clones or duplicate rosters. But that's just me. I'm a little bit risk averse. I like to spread it out, as kind of we've talked about on the Thanksgiving slate. So thank you for the submission this week, Gunslinger. The next 3 rosters we're going to review are all in 333 Wildcat, which is a 5,000 entrant contest. This roster comes from Inner Circle member Joseph Hood. It is a Purdy stack with Debo Samuel. Brought it back with AJ Brown. So really liked this correlation. Roster fades Zach Moss, and instead leverages that ownership fade with Derrick Henry and the Titans D instead. I thought this was really sharp. It was something that I did on a lot of my rosters as well. Roster then features Jaylen Warren and Greg Dortch mini correlation. I like that. I played it myself on the Wildcat roster this week. Sadly, it didn't pan out for us. The roster then, also accounts for the Dolphins with Waddle, which I liked getting a piece of that game. And then the final one-off on the roster is Brevin Jordan. It allows you to pay up for other pieces like AJ Brown, Debo Samuel, Waddle, Henry. So overall, a really strong build. Personally, nothing I would change. I really liked it. Thank you for the submission this week, Joseph Hood. The next roster comes from Inner Circle member Hunter Sanders, or Chick-fil-A Sandy, in DK. So again, another Wildcat entry with 5,000 entrants. This is a Jalen Hurts skinny stack with AJ Brown. Brought it back with Debo Samuel. So San Francisco stacks were much more popular. So I like the way of attacking this game a little bit differently. Such a good game environment. You've got Zach Moss and the Colts D. So I like incorporating the Colts D along with Zach Moss, just another way of some differentiation. And Indy's in a good spot here, facing rookie quarterback in Will Levis, making his 4th or 5th start. So the roster doesn't feature Tyreek Hill, but I like that you accounted for Miami by playing Devon Achane and Curtis Samuel as a mini correlation. So I really like this. And then the final 2 pieces are Jaylen Warren and Brevin Jordan. So we've spoken a bunch about Jordan, a strong price considered one-off piece. So both, for Jaylen Warren, both he and Najee Harris made my running back pool this week. As I mentioned on the last roster review, I played Warren in my only Wildcat roster this week, which we'll actually review next. And I think that, the Steelers just completely laid an egg. So we didn't get a great run out there, despite facing a 2-win Arizona team on the road. I think really wasn't aided by the weather, kind of being horrendous in Pittsburgh, or Pickett's ankle injury. And I think none of that helped us this week. But overall, a strong build, in my opinion. And thank you for the submission. And then, as promised, we're going to review my Wildcat submission. As you see, it completely bombed. It is a Howell double stack with Johan Dotson and Logan Thomas. Brought it back with Tyreek Hill. Personally, I went about 70% Tyreek Hill this week, which for me is basically locking a guy. I'm just a little more risk adverse than some other OWS contributors. So 75% is about the top that I'll go on a play. As discussed, it's a Jalen Warren and Greg Dortch mini correlation. Was a play that I really liked this week. I also played the Steelers D as well. Really liked them again at home against Arizona. It just didn't pan out for us this week. The Steelers, I think, were actually either my highest or second highest owned D on the entire slate. Roster then has Devin Singletary, kind of part of my rule of one Texan on basically all, or I think I had it at 80% of my rosters this week. And also played Brandon Ayuk as a one-off to get some exposure to the Philadelphia-San Francisco game, as we've talked about. I thought the situation really set up well for a 49ers pass catcher to hit. The Eagles' secondary has been gouged by wide receivers all season. Unfortunately, on this build, I picked the wrong San Francisco 49er, and had I gone with Debo for 33 points, it's another 20 points on this roster. So I just wanted to show a roster that I personally thought was well constructed, had some good correlation, yet didn't even score 100 points. Again, it's process over results. So I think in hindsight, I probably would have preferred Najee on this roster. I think that's a little bit better play with the Steelers D. If they're getting defensive touchdowns and smashing, I think that likely leads to more opportunities for Najee Harris versus Jalen Waddle. So again, winning is just so hard, and so many things need to break your way, even to just find yourself with a sweat on a given week. So I want to just encourage our OWS and Inner Circle members to stay disciplined, continue to improve your process, which you're doing by reflecting and watching the roster review shows to continue to get better. I got over 30 submissions again this week, so I apologize if I wasn't able to review your particular team on stream this week. But do please continue to submit each week. That said, thanks for joining me again this week, and I hope to see you and your OWS avatar at the top of the leaderboard come week 14. Thanks.